Hello, everybody. My name is Ilana, and I'm a research team lead in Pagaya, which is a large fintech investment company. I've been working in a field of financial time series forecasting for about 5 years and working in a field of time series forecasting in general for much longer than that. And I'm here to tell you about how I thought I could accurately predict a time series, but I realized I couldn't because my time series had regime changes and what I did to solve that problem. So in my talk, I will talk about what is regime change in time series forecasting, what they are, and how to cope with them in your forecasting system. So first of all, a regime change, or otherwise known as a structural break, is a phenomenon of change in the underlying statistical properties of a time series, or your data in general. It is usually driven by external factors such as changes in the market condition, economic trends, environmental factors, and so on. I will give you a simple example here of the euro to United States dollar index, which depicts how many dollars 1 euro can buy. And you can see here in the time series different events happening. And at each event, the time series changes significantly. And this was exactly where I found myself when the COVID pandemic hit and I was trying to make predictions. So what happens here, essentially? What happens here is the rules according to which the prices behave change. Simply put, the rules of the game change. And your model, which was trained on historical data, doesn't know that the rules of the game change. And so my models didn't know either. So what do you do with that? There are two important aspects to address here. First, you have to identify the change, the structural break. And the second, once you identify it, you have to address the structural break in your model. And this I will elaborate on shortly. So, as I said before, structural breaks are, first of all, a change in statistical properties of the time series. So it makes sense to use classic statistical models to test for this change. One of such very popular methods is the cumulative sum test, a test that tests for variability of linear regression coefficients from one sample to the other, predicting from one sample to the other. And of course, when there is a large change in the statistical properties of the data, the linear regression won't fit and the error will be very large. So let's see how this works. We can intuitively understand why this would work. In such a case, of course, you can see here that in each regime, the linear regression looks very differently, and the error from one point to another will be very large. Another very popular method for regime change detection is a family of algorithms called the change point detection algorithms. One of them is the PELT algorithm. It finds the optimal partitioning of the data into different halves that best fit the statistical properties of the data. It does so recursively and dynamically, and it fits many types of data, and also unequally sampled data and data with gaps. So it's very convenient and does a very good job. It's also available in the Rapture's Python library, so even better. And we can intuitively again see why this would work very well. Here I plotted for you the distribution of data in each regime, and you can see the distributions are very different. So it makes sense to look for these differences. The disadvantage of this method is that it's an offline method. You have to have all of your data in front of you in order to partition it correctly. And I will touch on this subject shortly. So another thing I said in the beginning is that regime changes are driven by external factors. So we can use domain knowledge to identify those external factors that affect our time series. And once we know them, we can monitor them and detect large changes in those features. Even more so, we can predict large changes in those domain features and predict when a regime change will happen. This will help us deal with it later. And again, for example, if we're looking at the price index, it makes sense, for example, to monitor the interest rate. Here plotted in orange. And you may ask yourself at this point, so if I know that this feature is important for my model, why not just add it to your model? And the reason this won't work, and this I also discovered during the pandemic, is that the relation between the feature and your target time series changes during a regime change. So your model trained on historical data won't know this change has happened, and it still tries to predict according to the old set of rules it learned previously. So, okay. So now I hope I convinced you that regime changes are important to detect. Now, once we detect them, what do we do with them in our models? It's important to address them in our models. So there are two approaches here to take. The one would be a reactive approach. You detect that you have that your time series has gone through a regime change, and then you pause everything because now you know your model is going to be wrong. You wait for some data of the new regime to arrive, and you retrain your model on this new data. Meanwhile, you can use a simpler model that will output less accurate predictions, but will rely on a simple set of features that will be less prone to the regime change. But this approach is, of course, has its drawbacks because it's reactive. While you're collecting more data on the new regime, you're outputting less accurate predictions. I propose to take the second approach, which is more proactive, making your model more adaptable to change. And you can do that by training several models on different regimes of your data, identified before by the identification methods, and then make an ensemble of models that will dynamically adapt to the changes in your data. The challenge becomes to identify what is the correct ensemble weighting in this ensemble. At each instance, we combine the model outputs according to the strength of each model at that instance. That way, we maximize the strengths of each model within the ensemble and adapt our model dynamically to the changing conditions. So since the weights are constantly being updated, we now don't have to wait for more data of new regime. We update it constantly. The advantage of this is also that now you don't have to estimate the weights of the whole model, but just to estimate the weight of your ensemble, which is usually a small number of parameters and requires a small number of data. So you can adjust your model very frequently. So to summarize, I've showed you, I've introduced you to the topic of regime change, how to identify it from the time series, and how to address it in the model by either retraining or dynamically adapting. And if there's one thing I'd like you to remember from this talk, is that you have to be prepared for the unexpected when working with time series data from the real world, and make your system adaptable to change. Don't assume that a model trained one time will be right forever. Thank you very much, and keep in touch.